They say that forgotten teachings do not disappear. They simply learn to whisper more quietly than the prayers meant to silence them. And perhaps that is why, on nights like this, when your room is dim and the world pretends to sleep, you can almost hear them. Old ideas clearing their throats in the dark, ancient truths stretching their legs after centuries of being politely ignored, like monks who overslept their vows of eternal vigilance. It is strange, isn't it? The way we bury the things we fear, only to find them sprouting back through the cracks of our certainty, like divine weeds that refuse to respect the gardener's sense of order. And so, let me begin with a question you were never meant to ask out loud. If the truth is eternal, why does everyone spend so much time trying to forget it? Ah, there it is, the first forbidden thought of the night. Congratulations. You've already done more spiritual work in one accidental moment than some theologians accomplish in an entire illuminated manuscript. But before you make the mistake of assuming this is simply background noise, the kind you let play while you slip toward sleep in that comfortable fog of semi-belief, do your small act of devotion to the digital temple, like the video, and subscribe. Only if you feel the tug, of course. Only if some part of you longs to see whether the algorithm's divine spark will shine mercifully upon your evening wanderings. Consider it a humble, modern prayer, a click offered to the unseen forces that rule your recommendations far more reliably than any celestial choir. Now, breathe, slowly, as if you were afraid the air itself might judge you, because tonight we enter a place where the dust is older than the doctrines, where low voices echo beneath stone arches, and where forgotten teachings wait with the patience of disappointed gods. Tonight, we speak of truths that were swept under rugs woven by trembling hands, of scrolls hidden behind the illusion of certainty. And above all, we speak of the small, inconvenient wisdoms the faithful pretended not to see, because really, who wants a revelation interrupting their comfortable habits? Imagine a long corridor lit by candles that doubt their own flame. Imagine a hallway of secrets, each locked behind a wooden door that creaks not from age but from reluctance. This is where the story begins, not in light, not in shadow, but in that narrow place between them, where things prefer to remain ambiguous. Because ambiguity is holy, though few dare admit it. Certainty is merely its loud, insecure cousin. But let me return to that whisper, that soft murmur that finds you only when you lie still enough to hear what doctrine never intended you to hear. It says, all teachings were once new, and all new things were once feared, except the ones that should have been. There is something humorous about that, isn't there? The way wisdom and foolishness dress alike, distinguished only by the footnotes scholars add centuries later. Divine irony at its finest. Tonight's tale is not merely about faith, nor doubt, nor the great cosmic tug-of-war between conviction and confusion. No, it is about the teachings themselves, the ones scribbled in margins by sleepy scribes, the ones muttered by wandering hermits who didn't realize anyone was listening, the ones politely excised by councils who felt that enlightenment should always be convenient and rarely surprising. These teachings were not lost. They were misfiled. And if you've ever seen a monastery library, you know that is a fate worse than damnation. There is a kind of sacred comedy in how humans approach the divine. We strive for clarity while worshiping mysteries, demand certainty from beings who communicate in riddles, and insist on absolute truth while ignoring anything that might complicate breakfast the next morning. Even angels, if they exist, must observe us with a kind of celestial bemusement, wondering why mortals insist on assembling IKEA-grade theologies with missing screws. And yet we do. Oh, how we do. And somewhere within this cosmic library of forgotten, ignored, misinterpreted, or accidentally spilled upon teachings, our story finds its way toward you, toward the listener who did not come here by accident, though you may pretend otherwise. The night has that effect. It guides you with the subtlety of a monk nudging your elbow during a poorly attended sermon. What I am about to tell you is not whispered lightly. These teachings were hidden not because they were too dangerous, but because they were too honest. Honesty is far more terrifying than danger. Terror at least gives you something to fight. Honesty simply sits there, waiting patiently for you to stop lying to yourself. But before we wander further down this corridor of inconvenient wisdom, let me tell you something you already know, but rarely admit. You're listening because some part of you wants to be unsettled, not frightened, not shocked, but gently displaced from the warm illusion that everything spiritual can be folded neatly into categories approved by polite conversation. You crave a little trembling in your soul, the way a candle craves the tiny breeze that reminds it is alive. And I will not deny you that. Now let us draw closer, slowly, reverently, ironically, to the first door. The forgotten teachings, the ones scribbled in ink that faded too quickly or burned too slowly. Teachings that whispered, God may not be who you think, and you may not be who you pray to be. Teachings that dared to suggest the universe might have a sense of humor far darker than ours. Teachings that hinted that maybe, just maybe, the divine does not micromanage your daily routine as closely as you hope. Imagine a teaching that read, even saints misunderstand things. Imagine another. The holiest path may be the one you refuse to walk because it looks inconvenient. And another, tucked into a corner like a child punished during theology class. If you're absolutely certain about anything spiritual, take a nap. Yes, those teachings, the ones that didn't survive the editing process. And so tonight, our story begins with a single phrase, carved into a cracked tablet found beneath a monastery that pretended it didn't exist. Truth hides where certainty refuses to kneel. A poetic phrase, unquestionably, but also deeply impractical for daily life, which is why it was never included in sermons. Imagine trying to explain that during a Sunday gathering. People prefer truth that arrives clean, ironed, and ready for liturgical use, not truth that wanders barefoot through philosophical mud. Still, that phrase remains, a ghost of wisdom drifting through the corridors of your thoughts, tapping gently on your consciousness like a lost pilgrim asking for shelter. You can ignore it, of course. People ignore truths all the time. But ignoring a truth does not make it leave. It simply waits in the doorway, checking its celestial pocket watch. Tonight, as you listen, as your mind drifts like incense smoke caught between devotion and sleep, I ask you to imagine yourself holding that tablet, fingers brushing across the ancient grooves. Feel the weight of the words. Feel the dust settle on your palms, the kind of dust that carries centuries of neglected revelations. Feel the uncomfortable warmth of something that knows more than you wish it did. Because this story, this long winding descent into irony, poetry, philosophy, and spiritual inconvenience begins with you, and the truth you did not ask to carry. A truth that glows faintly in the dark, waiting for you to stop pretending it isn't there. And so, with a breath as slow as a monk reading by candlelight, let us step beyond the threshold. the forgotten teachings stir. They open their ancient eyes. They smile, not a kind smile, nor a cruel one, but the smile of someone who has been waiting far too long for you to notice the obvious. Welcome to the story. Or perhaps, welcome back. Now tell me, if you wish to picture the world in which our protagonist lived, do not imagine a grand cathedral or a radiant temple adorned with polished marble and strategically placed cherubs. No. His world was far more modest, and therefore far more spiritually complicated. It was a monastery tucked into the ribs of a forgotten mountain range, a place so quiet that silence itself sometimes asked for a day off. The monks claimed the air was thin with holiness, though some suspected it was simply thin with oxygen. Either way, it kept everyone humble. The building was not particularly beautiful in the way tourists prefer their ruins. Its stones were uneven, its corridors slightly crooked, as though built by men who were devout in faith, but not especially gifted with measuring tools. The walls smelled of incense and stubbornness, a scent only monastic institutions truly master. And yet, if you stood in the courtyard at dawn, when the first light trembled across the tiled roof like a nervous blessing, you could swear the place breathed. Not metaphorically, physically, as if the monastery itself sighed each morning, preparing for another day of prayers it suspected would go unanswered. And in this crooked sanctuary lived Brother Aurelius not quite devoted, though of course that last part was never included in official records. Names are too dignified to capture the truth of a person, and Aurelius was no exception. He was tall in the way that made door frames nervous, with dark, thoughtful eyes that frequently wandered into philosophical territory they had no permission to enter. His beard, uneven and perpetually one day behind obedience, suggested a man who prayed diligently but shaved reluctantly. Aurelius belonged to an order known as the Quiet Scholars of the Ninth Lantern, a title that sounded impressive until you realized no one remembered what the first 8 lanterns had been for. The monks preserved silence, as though it were a fragile relic, breaking it only to argue about whose turn it was to repair the leaky roof, or chase out the occasional confused goat that mistook the courtyard for a divine pasture. Life in the monastery followed a strict rhythm: morning prayers at sunrise, philosophical study until noon, manual labor until the late afternoon, evening chants, and then extended contemplation of the universe's indifference until sleep, or the nearest approximation of it, arrived. The official motto of the order was Lux Aeternum Mentibus Nostris, eternal light to our minds. The unofficial motto was, Stay busy enough that doubt cannot find you. Aurelius followed this pattern with admirable consistency, though not always with admirable conviction. He prayed because everyone around him prayed, and because it seemed socially inappropriate not to. His lips moved with the gentle enthusiasm of a man reciting a well-intentioned grocery list. His thoughts, however, often drifted like rebellious incense smoke, curling into corners of curiosity where doctrine dared not look. He enjoyed the sound of ritual more than the meaning behind it. The soft shuffle of robes, the echo of chanting against stone, the rhythmic scratching of quills across parchment. To him, faith was less a roaring fire and more a candle that flickered politely when someone walked too quickly past it. Not extinguished, no, just easily intimidated. Every morning, Aurelius walked through the cloister garden, a square of cracked earth surrounded by arches that framed the sky like a theological painting someone forgot to finish. The garden contained herbs for healing and vegetables for eating, though the line between the two was often blurred because Brother Cassian, their resident gardener, insisted everything was medicinal if you believed hard enough. Aurelius once asked Cassian if cabbage could cure existential despair. Cassian nodded with certainty. Aurelius remained skeptical. Still, the scent of rosemary and wet soil comforted him, and the sound of sparrows hopping among the stones reminded him that not all creatures needed elaborate rituals to justify their existence. That thought alone was enough to make him feel slightly unmonastic. He moved through his days with the kind of mild diligence that supervisors love and prophets despise. He copied manuscripts, illuminating the margins with small sketches, nothing heretical, just little vines, birds, and once, accidentally, a creature that looked suspiciously like a theological contradiction. He swept corridors with meditative slowness. He rang the bell for prayers, sometimes with sincerity, sometimes with the lingering hope that God might complement his technique. But something about him was always slightly out of place. While the other monks seemed anchored to certainty, Aurelius floated, not aimlessly, more like a tethered balloon drifting gently above the heads of his brothers, held down only by habit and polite obligation. He believed in God, deeply, in fact, but with the casual trust one gives to a distant relative known mostly through rumors and inherited stories. Reverent familiarity, without the emotional paperwork. He found humor in places where the divine probably did not intend it. When Brother Gideon lectured about the dangers of pride while adjusting his robe as if preparing for a royal portrait, Aurelius felt a soft, heretical chuckle rise in his chest. When the abbot declared all mysteries must be understood eventually, while simultaneously admitting no one had ever successfully interpreted the ninth lantern's founding prophecy, Aurelius felt the corners of his mouth tug upward in quiet rebellion. He was not mocking the faith, just its human logistics, because that was the thing about human spirituality. The gods were grand, but their followers were endlessly, almost beautifully absurd. Still, Aurelius never voiced these observations. Irony is a dangerous spice in holy kitchens. He simply prayed at dawn, studied at midday, worked at dusk, and lay awake at night, contemplating truths that should be straightforward but never were. The monastery, in all its dusty grandeur, served as both womb and cage. The walls kept the outside world away, but they also kept Aurelius safe from the consequences of his own wandering mind. Any question too bold could be tucked neatly under the folds of routine. Any discomfort could be smothered in liturgical repetition. It worked for him. Mostly, the nights were the hardest. When the lamps burned low and the sky pressed its cold forehead against the windows, Aurelius would lie on his straw mattress and listen to the monastery breathe its ancient, uneven breaths. In that silence, his thoughts grew louder than his prayers. He wondered if faith required understanding or just endurance. He wondered whether God listened attentively or merely skimmed the highlights. He wondered whether anyone truly meant every word they spoke during prayer, or if sincerity fluctuated with the weather like everything else. But he rose each morning, ready to try again. Faith, after all, was a practice, and practices were forgiven for their imperfections. His fellow monks often misinterpreted his quietness for wisdom. Some believed he carried profound truths beneath his steady gaze. Others assumed he was too saintly to engage in worldly chatter. Only Aurelius knew the truth. He was simply thinking too much and too often, and in the monastery, excessive thought was indistinguishable from holiness. One winter evening, as snow whispered against the windows like a ghost requesting entry, Aurelius found himself alone in the scriptorium. The room glowed with the dim light of lanterns suspended from beams that had been polished smooth by centuries of hopeful hands. The long wooden table bore stains from spilled ink, candle wax, and the occasional teardrop, no one admitted whose. Aurelius dipped his quill into ink and paused, watching the droplet gather at the tip like a tiny black planet waiting for creation. Outside, wind rattled the shutters with the persistence of a theologian revising a sermon. He exhaled slowly. The air carried the scent of parchment, dust, and something that might have been spiritual longing, but could also have been mold. It wasn't that Aurelius lacked devotion. He simply lacked the certainty everyone else seemed to enjoy with such inconvenient enthusiasm. The others spoke of visions, miracles, signs, some subtle, others dramatic. Aurelius, meanwhile, experienced spiritual insights the way one experiences polite acquaintances, familiar, expected, but rarely invited to stay for dinner. And yet, beneath all his quiet doubt and gentle irony, Aurelius harbored a sincere, unspoken hope that somewhere, hidden beneath doctrine and dust, lay a truth simple enough to hold without trembling. He longed for a teaching that did not demand mental gymnastics or emotional endurance. Something clear, something honest, something that did not contradict itself after 3 interpretive councils and a late-night philosophical debate. He believed such a truth existed. He simply suspected no one would appreciate it if found. This belief alone made him feel like a spiritual exile, living among his own brothers. And so, Aurelius lived quietly, dutifully, almost devoutly, in the monastery that shaped him. He carried faith like a fragile relic, wrapped in careful irony. And, though he did not know it yet, the teachings he sought, the forgotten, inconvenient, unsettling ones, were waiting for him like old friends eager to ruin his sense of order. But that is still to come. For now, he remains a man on the edge of revelation, wandering through stone corridors warmed by candlelight, not yet aware that his life is about to fold inward, like a page rewritten by an impatient scribe. Because faith, dear listener, rarely shatters without warning. First, it trembles. And Aurelius was already trembling, just enough that a forgotten truth could find him. Before the cracks formed, before doubt slipped beneath Aurelius's ribs like cold water entering a warm house, his faith was a quiet, obedient thing. Not radiant, not triumphant, not the kind of faith sung about by zealots or painted into stained glass saints. No, his faith was gentler, humbler, and, if he were honest, slightly underachieving. The kind of faith that nodded politely when others spoke of miracles, then went about its chores hoping no metaphysical paperwork would be assigned to it. He believed in God the way some people believe in constellations. The shapes were comforting, the stories interesting, and the general idea pleasant enough, provided no one asked him to do trigonometry. His heart leaned naturally toward reverence, but his mind refused to sign any documents without reading the fine print. This created a small but persistent tension within him, like 2 monks playing tug-of-war with a prayer rug, each insisting the other was overthinking it. Still, Aurelius did believe. Oh, yes. He believed with the sort of dutiful consistency found in people who were raised on equal parts, scripture and household expectations. Faith was simply what one did, like sweeping floors, nodding respectfully to elders, or pretending to enjoy cabbage stew. It was woven into him long before he was old enough to wonder whether it itched. He believed in miracles, though in a manner not entirely approved of by theologians. To Aurelius, miracles were like seasonal sales at the market, rumored to exist, rarely witnessed firsthand, and often exaggerated by those who claimed to have seen them. He liked the idea of miracles. He simply doubted they occurred with the frequency others insisted upon. If Brother Matthias declared that a candle burned longer than expected, Aurelius chalked it up to the wick being particularly stubborn, rather than divine energy rearranging its weekend schedule. Yet he still prayed, not fervently, but faithfully. His prayers rose like cautious smoke, thin, wandering, uncertain whether they were meant for heaven or simply the ceiling beams. He did not expect answers. He barely expected acknowledgement. But the act itself soothed him, the way humming soothes someone who doesn't realize they're anxious. Prayer was his anchor, even if it held him in place more than it lifted him upward. Aurelius admired devotion in others, the way one admires impressive acrobatics, appreciative, slightly intimidated, and secretly aware he would never attempt such feats himself. When Brother Gideon knelt for hours without moving, Aurelius marveled, and also wondered whether Gideon's legs had achieved a level of numbness worthy of sainthood. When Sister Theophila, who occasionally visited from a nearby convent, claimed to feel divine warmth during evening liturgy, Aurelius felt genuinely happy for her, and also curious whether she sat too close to the brazier. He believed in divine order, though he sometimes suspected the universe had misplaced its organizational chart. The world seemed too full of miscommunication, delayed blessings, and unanswered requests for everything to be operating smoothly. If heaven kept records, Aurelius imagined the archives resembled the monastery attic, stacks of forgotten scrolls, misplaced letters, and divine memos accidentally sealed inside old hymnals. It comforted him, oddly enough, to think of God as occasionally overwhelmed. It made the divine feel more approachable, more human, though he knew he wasn't supposed to think that. His teachers insisted faith required surrender, but Aurelius found surrender to be a very complicated verb. What exactly was he surrendering? His questions, his doubts, his habit of mentally dissecting every metaphor until it confessed either brilliance or nonsense. He could never quite manage it. Every time he tried to surrender, his mind gently tapped him on the shoulder and whispered, "Are we sure this is wise?" And once a thought starts whispering, surrender becomes a performance rather than a genuine offering. Still, Aurelius tried. Oh, how he tried! He lit candles with the seriousness of a man preparing for spiritual negotiations. He recited psalms with a voice soft enough to seem reverent and loud enough to seem engaged. He closed his eyes during meditation, though often he simply used the darkness to reorganize his internal philosophical furniture. He participated in rituals, even those whose instructions read more like poetic riddles than practical guidelines. His faith was not grand, but it was steady. It lived in the small rituals. The gentle way he touched the prayer beads each morning, the pause he made before opening a sacred text, the silent nod he offered whenever something beautiful made his chest ache for reasons he couldn't articulate. Those moments were his true devotion, subtle but sincere. He often imagined faith as a lantern carried through fog. His brothers carried torches blazing with certainty. Aurelius carried a small flame that flickered whenever he exhaled too deeply. Yet the flame never died. Not once. Even when doubts crept in like mischievous mice nibbling at the edges of doctrine, his faith glowed patiently, asking for nothing more than the simple honesty of being acknowledged. Faith, for Aurelius, was not a fortress, but a fragile cathedral built from longing and habit. It was held together not by the grandeur of revelation, but by the gentle hope that meaning existed somewhere beneath all the ceremonial dust. He trusted God, albeit cautiously, the way one trusts a distant landlord one has never seen, but assumes exists because the house has not yet collapsed. He believed heaven listened, maybe not attentively, but perhaps in the way a busy teacher listens while grading papers. He trusted Scripture, though he suspected it suffered from the same problem as most ancient texts: too many editors. He loved the Psalms, especially the ones that sounded like the author was having a spiritual meltdown. Those felt relatable. He admired the prophets, but suspected some of them were simply terrible at small talk and overcompensated with dramatic visions. He respected theology the way one respects a well-built bridge: useful, admired from a distance, but terrifying if required to stand on for too long. Aurelius's relationship with God was neither intimate nor distant. It was cordial, a polite arrangement. God provided the general structure of the universe, and Aurelius provided occasional expressions of gratitude. And, like many polite relationships, both sides maintained a comfortable emotional distance, allowing interactions to proceed smoothly without requiring excessive honesty. And yet, beneath all this quiet, ironic reverence lay something deeper, a yearning he rarely acknowledged, a hunger for clarity, a hope that one day God might lean close and whisper something unmistakably real into the world, something beyond ritual, beyond metaphor, beyond theological interpretive juggling, something that didn't require footnotes. He longed for a truth so simple it would make all the contradictions collapse like tired monks. He longed for peace, not the peace offered by silent halls and repeated prayers, but the peace of finally knowing, of finally seeing, of finally understanding why the world trembled between meaning and absurdity. But yearning is dangerous. It attracts answers, and answers rarely arrive in the form expected. Before everything cracked, Aurelius thought he understood the rhythm of faith. A little devotion, a little confusion, a generous drizzle of routine, sprinkled with the occasional sense of holiness. It was simple enough to maintain, predictable, like a hymn sung too frequently, comforting, like a ritual repeated so often that no one remembers why it began. He thought faith was a soft blanket covering the coldness of reality. He thought doubt was a minor inconvenience, a draft that entered through cracks in spiritual windowsills. He thought teachings, especially the forgotten ones, were harmless curiosities, not dynamite waiting for the faintest spark of awareness. He thought the universe polite, predictable, well-behaved. He thought wrong, of course, because faith, before it shatters, is always at its most beautiful, and most fragile, and most delusional. Aurelius had no idea that beneath the quiet comfort of his belief, a fissure was already forming, thin as a hairline crack in a sacred chalice, invisible in lamplight, but inevitable under pressure. The teachings he was never meant to read were gathering their breath. The truths buried under centuries of doctrinal tidying were stretching like ancient bones. Something was approaching. Something whispered. Something remembered. But Aurelius, in his innocence, continued carrying his little lantern through the fog, convinced the path was stable, the world predictable, and his faith durable enough to withstand whatever small questions life might toss his way. After all, nothing truly challenges faith until it does, and it always begins with something subtle, something small, something that should not matter at all. But that comes next. It began, as all great spiritual catastrophes do, with something embarrassingly small. Not a thunderclap, not a divine visitation, not a flaming prophecy descending from the heavens like an overconfident meteor. No. Aurelius's faith, carefully maintained, gently watered, dusted regularly, began to unravel because of a conversation. A single, profoundly unremarkable conversation held on an afternoon so ordinary that even the monastery cats seemed bored by it. It happened in the cloister garden, where the rosemary bushes leaned toward the sunlight like elderly monks, leaning in to hear gossip. Aurelius was tending to a patch of thyme that, for reasons unknown to botany or theology, refused to grow straight. Brother Cassian approached, his sandals whispering across the stone path, like a secret trying to be discreet but failing. Cassian was the sort of monk who radiated enthusiasm for everything except silence. He believed every problem could be solved with either prayer or compost, and he often confused which was meant for which situation. His robe smelled faintly of soil and misplaced optimism. "Brother Aurelius," he said, kneeling beside him, "have you ever wondered why the 9th lantern never glows, even though the prophecy insists it must?" Aurelius blinked slowly, as if Cassian had asked whether shadows ever suffered from low self-esteem. "I cannot say the 9th lantern has been at the forefront of my concerns." Cassian nodded, with the seriousness of a man who had just diagnosed a minor spiritual deficiency. "It's puzzling, isn't it? The prophecy states it will illuminate when the truest teaching is discovered. Yet many centuries have passed, and the lantern remains as dark as Brother Matthias's sense of humor." Aurelius plucked a stray weed from the soil. Perhaps the prophecy was symbolic. Cassian stared at him, eyes wide in the way only a man who truly believed everything was literal could manage. Symbolic? No, no. Our founder was very clear. The lantern will shine when a forgotten teaching is restored. Aurelius offered a small, ironic smile. "And how are we to find such a teaching? Check behind the bookshelves." Cassian gasped, as though Aurelius had just spoken an accidental revelation. "Brother Aurelius, that is a brilliant idea." "No, Cassian." But Cassian had already risen, dusted his robe, and hurried off toward the scriptorium with the speed of a prophet late for an appointment. Aurelius sighed. He had not meant to inspire anything, least of all hope. He returned to his stubborn thyme, though the thought, ridiculous, harmless, lingered in the back of his mind. A forgotten teaching, one waiting to be found, one powerful enough to make a lantern glow. It sounded like the plot of a parable intended to teach humility, but instead encouraging unnecessary adventure. He dismissed it, mostly, but the seed was planted, and the universe, mischievous as ever, watered it at once. Later that evening, as the monks gathered for their meal, Aurelius found himself across from Brother Gideon, whose sense of spiritual superiority was so refined it required its own seat at the table. Gideon filled his spoon with stew, thick, unidentifiable, suspiciously chunky, and spoke in the tone of a man who enjoyed hearing his own sanctity resonate. "I heard Cassian rummaging in the scriptorium earlier," he said, sniffing the stew with distrust. "He muttered something about a teaching our order may have forgotten." Aurelius froze mid-bite. Gideon narrowed his eyes. "Do you think there are teachings we have overlooked?" Aurelius swallowed slowly, very slowly. "I think the teachings we remember are usually quite enough." "Exactly," Gideon said, delighted by his own conclusion. If there were anything else to know, the divine would have revealed it clearly, probably with a sign impossible to misinterpret. Aurelius nodded, though he doubted any sign was immune to human reinterpretation. But again the seed trembled. That night, as Aurelius lay in his cot beneath the faint flicker of a dying candle, he replayed Cassian's question. Have you ever wondered why the ninth lantern never glows? It was absurd, irrelevant, absolutely unworthy of serious contemplation. And yet, he sighed. He closed his eyes. He tried counting prayers the way some counted sheep. But a strange dream nudged him awake before his thoughts settled. In the dream, Aurelius stood in the monastery's long-shadowed corridor, the one lined with tapestries depicting scenes of spiritual triumph, all of which looked suspiciously like allegorical warnings. At the far end of the hall hung the ninth lantern, unlit as always. But in the dream, it flickered. Just once. A soft, uncertain quiver of light, like a child raising its hand halfway in class. Aurelius stepped closer, watching the flame that wasn't there shimmer with the confidence of a first-time performer. It pulsed faintly, then spilled a drop of light onto the stone floor. Not bright, not warm, just there. An impossible thing happening quietly, as impossible things tend to do. He reached out, and the lantern whispered, not in a language he recognized, nor one that belonged to any scripture. It whispered like parchment crumpling, like a forgotten truth stretching after a long sleep. A sound both ancient and fragile. He leaned in to hear, then awoke abruptly, sitting upright in the darkness, heart pounding like a monk who realized he'd overslept morning prayers. He pressed a hand to his chest, breathing slowly, scooping stray fragments of the dream into his waking mind. The lantern, the flicker, the whisper. Ah, dream, he muttered aloud. Just a dream. But dreams are rarely just dreams in monasteries. In such places, even indigestion may be interpreted as divine communication, which unfortunately meant the dream was now lodged in Aurelius's memory, with the sticky permanence of theological glue. The next morning, the monastery felt different. Not visibly, not audibly, nothing had changed. But there was a subtle tension in the air, as though reality were holding its breath. Aurelius laughed at himself for noticing it, and the laugh sounded slightly nervous. Was it possible? Could a forgotten teaching actually exist? Something overlooked, hidden, neglected. A truth that once mattered deeply and then slipped through the cracks of time and interpretation. He didn't believe it. He didn't want to believe it. But the thought clung to him like incense smoke. Later that day, while sweeping a hallway that had already been swept twice, Aurelius overheard two novices whispering. They say Cassian found something last night, one said. A teaching? The other asked. No, a mouse. But he insists the mouse led him to a suspicious bookshelf. Aurelius shut his eyes. Of course. Cassian had now enlisted a mouse as his prophetic assistant. He continued sweeping, though now with the grim awareness that this absurd little rumor was feeding the seed of doubt even further. What if Cassian's foolish pursuit accidentally led somewhere? Stranger things had happened. Most scriptures were full of outcomes stranger than that. At noon, Aurelius visited the scriptorium, intending to copy a sermon on humility that had not aged particularly well. But as he entered, he paused. Something felt off. The room was in its usual disarray, scrolls stacked like precarious spiritual aspirations, quills scattered like feathers plucked by impatient angels. But one thing stood out, a single book, pulled slightly askew on the shelf. He stared at it. It stared back, metaphorically. Aurelius frowned. Cassian must have disturbed it. Surely. But something about the tilt of the book, its angle, its distance from the other volumes, felt deliberate, as though someone intended it to be noticed. He approached. He hesitated. He reminded himself of the long and proud religious tradition of ignoring anything unusual for the sake of sanity. Then he touched the spine and felt something shift inside him, not dramatically, not epically, just enough to make his breath catch. He slid the book free. Dust drifted from it like the exhalation of a tired relic. The cover bore no title, no markings, nothing to suggest its importance or its danger. He opened it. The first page was blank. So was the second. So was the third. Then, on the fourth page, faint and crooked, as though written by someone unsure whether they were permitted to write at all, lay a single sentence. What you fear to question is the teaching you most need. Aurelius exhaled sharply and closed the book. Too fast, too nervously. He placed it back on the shelf. He stepped away. He left the room. But the sentence followed him. It clung to him like shadow. It settled behind his eyes, whispering quietly, "What you fear to question." He knew the seed had now sprouted. He knew something had shifted, however slightly. He knew doubt had finally, gracefully, inexorably stepped into the light. And the irony was delicious. The teachings he feared most were the ones he'd never imagined existed. The lantern in his dream flickered once more in memory, then whispered again. And Aurelius, gentle, dutiful, ironic Aurelius, felt the trembling of a truth he was not ready to meet. Not yet, but soon, very soon. Denial, when practiced with devotion, can be indistinguishable from faith. And Aurelius, gentle, cautious, earnest Aurelius, entered this stage with the enthusiasm of a monk trying to drown out an inconvenient truth beneath several layers of holy noise. He woke the morning after, discovering the peculiar sentence in the blank book with a plan so bold, so spiritually elaborate, so thoroughly misguided, that even the monastery's dust motes seemed to pause midair to judge him. He would simply believe harder. It was the most ancient remedy for doubt known to contemplative humanity. If one's faith trembled, if one's heart quivered, if one's internal spiritual architecture started leaking mysterious liquids, one merely hit it with a larger hammer of conviction. Aurelius rose from his cot with the determined expression of a man ready to pretend he had not seen what he had very obviously seen. "Today," he whispered to himself, "I will be unwavering." Immediately, he stubbed his toe on the bed frame. He took it as a test. He hobbled into morning prayers with heroic overcommitment. While the brothers chanted in slow, measured harmony, Aurelius projected his voice as though auditioning for a sacred opera no one else knew existed. His tone wavered on the edge of desperation, reaching notes typically accessible only to monks experiencing spiritual epiphanies or stepping on particularly sharp stones. Brother Gideon glanced sideways at him, startled. Even the abbot paused mid-chant, eyebrows rising in mild liturgical alarm. But Aurelius continued, each note insisting to the universe, I believe. Please don't misunderstand what happened last night. It meant nothing." When the chanting ended, he kept going for 2 extra syllables, leaving an awkward echo floating in the chapel like an unclaimed prayer. Next came the rituals. Aurelius performed each one with exaggerated care, bordering on parody. He crossed himself so slowly that time itself seemed to roll its eyes. He bowed with such acute reverence that the floorboards, unused to such affection, creaked in embarrassment. He lit candles with trembling solemnity, as if each flame carried the weight of the cosmos and perhaps a small apology. During meditation, he sat ramrod straight, eyes squeezed, shut, face contorted into the expression of someone attempting to wrestle enlightenment into submission. His breaths were heavy, dramatic, the kind that suggested deep spiritual improvement, but sounded suspiciously like theatrical sighing. When the abbot walked past, Aurelius leaned ever so slightly more still, hoping stillness itself could drown out doubt. But denial is a slippery creature. The harder one grips it, the more it slides between the fingers. By midday, the sentence he had discovered, "What you fear to question is the teaching you most need," had already repeated itself in his mind, enough times to qualify as an unwanted mantra. Whenever he tried to focus on scripture, it whispered beneath his reading. Whenever he tried to sweep the floors, it drifted through the corridors like a mischievous echo. Whenever he tried to breathe, it sat quietly in each inhale, politely refusing to leave. He distracted himself with humility exercises, scrubbing pots, repairing sandals, cleaning candle wax from the altar. But each time he bent toward his task, there it was, the phrase curling around him like a philosophical snake. "What you fear to question." "I fear nothing," Aurelius whispered back at it. But the sentence, being a sentence, did not respond. Irony, however, did. Because denial is not only a mental stance, it is also an aesthetic choice. Aurelius decided that if he behaved like a man of unshakable faith, perhaps his faith would remember its obligations and cooperate. So he made his devotion visible, dramatically visible, unignorable. During the afternoon prayers, when monks gathered in the courtyard to recite psalms under the open sky, Aurelius positioned himself directly in the beam of sunlight filtering between two arches. He stood so still, so reverently, so radiantly hopeful, that he resembled a saint in training, or, alternatively, a man trying very hard to impress the sky. His voice was soft this time, too soft, almost performative in its gentleness, the kind of whisper that said, "Behold my serenity. Please ignore my spiritual panic. Brother Cassian noticed." "Aurelius," he whispered after the prayer ended, "you seem unusually luminous today." Aurelius forced a serene smile, just deeply present. Cassian squinted. "Are you? You look like you're trying to convince the sun to adopt you." Aurelius walked away before Cassian's earnest concern could unravel him further. But the worst moment arrived during evening study. He sat in the scriptorium, copying a historical account detailing the early days of the monastery. A thrilling tale of bureaucratic arguments, misinterpreted omens, and the founding monk accidentally setting his robe on fire while attempting to demonstrate divine favor with a torch. Aurelius tried to focus. He really tried. But each stroke of his quill felt like writing a confession he hadn't agreed to sign. The room felt too quiet, too attentive, as though the shelves themselves were leaning in. Finally, in a moment of frantic inspiration or misguided genius, Aurelius decided that what he needed was more faith in writing. So he wrote a small spiritual affirmation in the margin. "I do not question what must not be questioned." The ink dried. The sentence stared back at him. It looked guilty. He crossed it out, then rewrote it, then crossed it out again, then underlined it. Twice. When he realized what he was doing, he shut the book and placed his hands over his face, massaging the bridge of his nose with the desperation of a man trying to knead certainty back into his skull. "Stop," he whispered to himself. "Stop thinking. Stop wondering. Stop remembering that sentence." This was, of course, the exact recipe for ensuring he thought, wondered, and remembered more intensely. Denial, in its brilliance, always sharpens the very thing it seeks to dull. That night, Aurelius redoubled his efforts. He prayed before bed. He prayed after lying down. He prayed with the fervor of a man trying to drown out a leak in the roof by shouting at it. He squeezed his eyes shut and declared silently, "I believe completely, fully, utterly, absolutely, unequivocally, without exception." The universe blinked, then answered with a soft, ironic creak from the wooden beams above him. Aurelius pretended he didn't hear it. He turned onto his side. The sentence whispered again, "What you fear to question." He stuffed the blanket over his ears. He curled into himself. He mentally recited every doctrinal point he could remember in alphabetical order with footnotes. None of it helped, because denial does not remove doubt. It decorates it. And Aurelius, poor, earnest, self-deceiving Aurelius, was now draping his doubt in shining robes, parading it through the corridors of his faith, like a guest he hoped no one would notice. The next morning revealed the truth with cruel elegance. During morning prayers, as the brothers recited in unison, Aurelius felt his voice falter. Not dramatically, no one else noticed, but he noticed. A small quiver, a tremble where certainty should stand. He tried again. Another tremble. His jaw tightened. His heart sank. Because beneath all his rituals, all his performances, all his brilliant attempts to drown out the whisper, one thing had become painfully clear. He was no longer praying to believe. He was praying to forget. And nothing corrodes faith faster. He finished the chant with the mechanical precision of a man who has realized he is losing a battle he did not intend to fight. When the final Amen drifted into silence, he remained kneeling longer than the others, hoping the stone floor might lend him some of its solidity. It didn't. When he finally stood, he felt the unmistakable truth settle into him, heavy as an unwelcome guest. Denial could no longer protect him. The seed had sprouted, and now it was growing, and now it was hungry, and now Aurelius was beginning to sense that whatever he had stumbled into was not merely a question, but the beginning of a revelation wearing the costume of doubt. And revelations, as everyone knows, are patient wolves. What came next would test him far more than denial ever could, because the truth does not knock, it enters uninvited. Signs are the universe's favorite practical joke, always arriving precisely when you do not need them, and never when you file an official request. Aurelius, now thoroughly entangled in the quiet warfare between doubt and denial, began noticing things. Not real things, perhaps, or maybe too real, but things nonetheless. Little coincidences that hovered just at the edge of meaning, taunting him like sacred riddles written by a bored scribe. The first sign appeared at breakfast. A simple morning ritual. Porridge, silence, steam rising from clay bowls like weary prayers drifting upward. Aurelius sat between Brother Cassian, who always smelled faintly of radishes, and Brother Gideon, whose breath could wither entire theological arguments. Aurelius lowered his spoon into the porridge. It splashed in a perfect circle. Not remarkable. But then, the circle widened, forming a shape, not quite symmetrical, vaguely human, faintly familiar. Aurelius blinked. Was it a face? A saint? A spirit? His own reflection distorted by the steam? Or simply porridge arranging itself without divine supervision? Brother Cassian leaned closer. Is that an omen? Aurelius stiffened. It's breakfast. But Cassian, being Cassian, whispered, It resembles Saint Clarissimo. See? The nose, the eyes, the inexplicable expression of mild disappointment. Aurelius stared. It did resemble mild disappointment. But then, so did most porridge. He pushed the bowl away. It's a coincidence. Cassian nodded solemnly, as though Aurelius had said something either wise or profoundly misguided. Of course. Coincidence. The sacred cousin of miracles. Aurelius pinched the bridge of his nose. One sign. He could ignore one sign. Except signs, once they begin appearing, tend to develop social lives. The second sign arrived shortly after breakfast, during scripture study. Aurelius sat at a heavy oak desk, flipping through an illuminated manuscript, whose margins contained more decorative flourishes than theological substance. As he traced a line of text with his finger, a page fluttered open on its own. A breeze? A draft? A ghost with bad aim? Hard to say. The page it landed on contained a single line from the founder of the Ninth Lantern Order. The truth that hides from you is the one you fear to confront. Aurelius froze. The sentence in the mysterious blank book had said, "What you fear to question is the teaching you most need." 2 phrases, same structure, same tone, same irritating insight delivered with cryptic smugness. Coincidence? He tried, truly tried, to believe so. But the air felt heavier. He closed the manuscript. He reopened it. It landed on the same page. He shut it. Again. Reopened it. Same page. He glared at the manuscript with the intensity of a man trying to intimidate paper into behaving reasonably. With exaggerated care, he flipped to a completely different book, opened it, and began reading. And then that book fell open on its own to a passage discussing the dangers of ignoring subtle teachings. "No," Aurelius whispered, standing abruptly. "Absolutely not. I am not doing this." The novice at the next desk glanced over nervously as though Aurelius had just threatened the entire doctrine with insubordination. Aurelius gathered his things and left before the universe could present him with another aggressively helpful suggestion. He marched into the cloister garden, inhaled the cold air, and told himself firmly, "There are no signs, only accidents." But the universe, having heard this kind of declaration many times, decided to offer a third sign for good measure. A small sparrow landed on the stone fountain near him. Nothing notable, but then it hopped toward him, then away, then toward him again, and then pecked at a piece of parchment sticking out of his sleeve. He frowned. He pulled the parchment free. It was the page he had scribbled on yesterday, the one where he wrote, crossed out, rewrote, and underlined, "I do not question what must not be questioned." Only now, the ink of the crossed-out sentence had smeared slightly, forming a faint shadow beneath the words, as though the universe had decided to highlight the exact thing he wished to ignore. The sparrow pecked the sentence again. Aurelius whispered, horrified, "Stop helping." The sparrow chirped innocently, then flew away. 3 signs, too many. But the universe had no intention of stopping. The 4th sign arrived during chores when Aurelius was sweeping dust from the hallway. Dust, it seemed, that had existed since before the invention of dust. As he swept, his broom caught on something, a small stone, smooth, round, engraved with a symbol he recognized from childhood teachings, the emblem of the first lantern, lost centuries ago, according to legend. Aurelius knelt. The symbol stared at him. He stared back. Was it a relic? A replica? A misplaced teaching aid? A prank? Or a sign? He set the stone aside gingerly, as if it were judging him. By late afternoon, Aurelius's nerves resembled frayed parchment held together by stubbornness and a mild hope that he was simply tired. He retreated to the kitchen, seeking distraction in the familiar non-metaphorical comfort of cabbage stew. But cabbage, too, can betray. For when he lifted the pot lid, the rising steam formed, briefly, impossibly, another shape. Not a saint this time, not a symbol. Something stranger, something unhelpfully literal. the outline of a lantern. Aurelius slammed the lid back down. Absolutely not. Brother Matthias, standing nearby, raised an eyebrow. Is the stew defective again? No, Aurelius muttered. I am defective. I mean, not defective. Distracted. No, never mind. He fled the kitchen. 5 signs. The universe was now showing off. But the 6th sign was the worst, the one that broke through his rational defenses, pried open the lid of denial, and whispered into his heart with the gentle cruelty of truth. It happened at sunset. Aurelius stood alone in the courtyard, breathing slowly, trying to remind himself that the world was orderly, predictable, fundamentally uninterested in creating metaphysical scavenger hunts. The sky burned with orange light. Shadows stretched across the stones. The air smelled of wax and distant wood smoke. Aurelius looked toward the entrance hall, and the 9th lantern flickered. Not in a dream, not metaphorically, not as a trick of the light. It flickered, a soft, brief, impossible tremor of brightness, like a dying star inhaling sharply. He blinked. It flickered again. Then darkness. The monastery remained silent. The world remained unchanged. But Aurelius felt something shift in him, a plate tectonic movement beneath the soul, subtle yet undeniable. No, he whispered to the lantern. Don't do that. The lantern, being a lantern, did not apologize. That wasn't real, Aurelius assured himself. He stood still, breath slow, heart faster. Thought, panicked. He took a step closer. The lantern remained dark. He waited. A minute passed, then another, then another. Nothing. For a moment he wondered if he had imagined the entire thing. But his body knew. His body remembered. And memory, especially unwelcome memory, is far louder than reason. He closed his eyes, hoping darkness might undo what he'd seen. But when he opened them again, dust fell from the lantern's edge. Fresh dust, as though something had shaken it. Aurelius exhaled. Why, he whispered to no one, couldn't you send clear signs, helpful signs, signs with instructions? A celestial numbered list would be appreciated. The universe, deeply committed to ambiguity, declined to respond. And so Aurelius, assaulted on all sides by coincidences too coincidental to be coincidences, began walking backward through his own denial, step by trembling step. He held on to certainty the way one holds onto a rope, dragging them toward a cliff. Yet even now, as the signs mounted like an unavoidable sermon, Aurelius refused to admit that something was truly happening. Instead, he convinced himself of something far more absurd. He was imagining it, all of it, every sign, every whisper, every flicker, every symbol. Maybe he was tired, overworked, spiritually dehydrated. Maybe Cassian's enthusiasm was contagious. Maybe he was caught in a psychological feedback loop caused by too much incense exposure. Anything, except the possibility that something divine or dangerous or inconveniently revelatory was unfolding around him. Because if the signs were real, then the forgotten teachings might be real. And if the forgotten teachings were real, then everything else might be something else entirely. He stood in the courtyard until the stars appeared, those ancient mocking witnesses who watch human confusion with serene detachment. Fine, he whispered to the sky, send no more signs. I won't look. Then, moments later, as if on cue, he tripped over the same stone he'd found earlier. He glared upward. The stars twinkled, pretending innocence, and Aurelius realized, slowly, reluctantly, beautifully, that the universe was not giving him answers. It was giving him questions, the most unhelpful gift of all. Crisis does not descend like a storm. Storms have dignity. Lightning announces itself. Thunder requests attention. Even rain, dramatic as it can be, has the courtesy to begin in droplets before turning the world into a wet theological metaphor. No, Aurelius's crisis arrived like a soft cough in a silent chapel, barely audible, easily ignored. And then suddenly, impossible to stop hearing. After the barrage of unhelpful signs, Aurelius did what any spiritually overwhelmed monk with too much imagination and not enough emotional training would do. He tried to continue his life as usual. The problem was that his life no longer agreed. Everything felt slightly off, as if someone had tilted reality by 1 degree, and now nothing sat quite where it should. The monastery halls seemed narrower. The candles burned with an attitude. Even the stones beneath his feet felt as though they were hiding secrets, shifting microscopically each time he stepped on them, as if reluctant to bear the weight of someone teetering on metaphysical uncertainty. Morning prayers became awkward. Aurelius stood among his brothers, chanting, bowing, kneeling, rising, his body performing each gesture with the muscle memory of a life he feared was slipping out of his hands. But his mind hovered elsewhere, like a distracted angel forgetting which mortal it was supposed to inspire. His voice trembled, his breaths hiccuped. His heart beat with the frantic enthusiasm of a novice asked to summarize the book of Revelation with no prior reading. He whispered the final Amen with the uneasy awareness that his faith, once small but dependable, now resembled candle wax melting unevenly down an altar, pooling into strange shapes that demanded interpretation. He left the chapel feeling more disassembled than uplifted. The monastery offered no comfort. Corridors that once felt familiar now hummed with a strange tension. The old tapestries depicting saints, prophets, and ambiguous divine events seemed to watch him with new intensity, their woven eyes following him like disappointed teachers waiting for him to explain his recent performance. Even the air felt judgmental. Aurelius told himself he was imagining this. But imagination, especially the panicked kind, has excellent hearing. He went to the cloister garden, hoping soil and sunlight might soothe him. They didn't. The thyme, plants, which normally leaned lazily toward the warmth, now seemed to tilt toward him instead, as if offering botanical condolences. The sparrows, usually noisy, sat in an unnerving line along the garden wall, staring at him with the solemnity of a jury convened for a trial he didn't know he was in. Aurelius bowed his head, inhaled, exhaled, attempted calm, failed. He fled to the one place he hoped would remain stable, the scriptorium. But even the scriptorium betrayed him. Books, a category of object he had trusted his entire life, now held an unmistakable air of smugness. They leaned against each other like conspirators. Their spines gleamed suspiciously. Their pages rustled in ways that sounded dangerously like whispering. He approached a desk, took quill in hand, tried to resume copying a harmless sermon about humility written by a monk who clearly misunderstood the assignment. But, as he wrote, ink pooled strangely. Letters wavered, words twisted, sentences seemed to rearrange themselves mid-stroke. He blinked hard, convinced exhaustion was playing cruel tricks on his eyes. No good. He pushed the manuscript away. And then, even worse, the blank book from earlier sat on the shelf exactly where he had left it, but now slightly angled, as though it had turned itself to face him. Aurelius backed away. Books should not exhibit body language. He walked out, heart pounding, robe swirling behind him like a frightened ghost. He sought refuge in chores, manual tasks, physical grounding, activities that did not require interpreting omens or decoding cosmic sarcasm. He was assigned to sweep the eastern corridor. Simple, except that the broom bristles kept catching on invisible bumps. The stones felt uneven beneath him. The light from the narrow windows wavered in a way that made him feel like he was walking inside a giant metaphor written by someone in a dramatic mood. Then, halfway down the corridor, his broom hit a patch of dust that refused to move. He pushed harder. Still no movement. He knelt, touching it. The dust formed a faint pattern, a circle, and inside the circle, 2 tiny marks, like eyes, a face. Staring up at him, Aurelius stood, slowly, very slowly. His breath left him in an undignified gasp. "No," he said out loud, "absolutely not. I am not being haunted by dust." A faint breeze blew down the corridor, dispersing the face. He exhaled in relief. But then, to his horror, the dust rearranged itself, forming the same face again. Aurelius dropped the broom. He walked away with the stiff posture of a man refusing to acknowledge he is fleeing. By now, crisis had him in its tender, merciless hands. And so the universe escalated. At lunch, the monks gathered in the refectory. The room buzzed softly with the sound of spoons tapping against bowls. Aurelius took his seat, attempting composure. But when he lifted his spoon to his mouth, something shifted. The entire bowl of stew rippled, not stirred, rippled. He froze. Cassian leaned over. "Is your lunch breathing?" Aurelius set the spoon down. His appetite left the room. He pushed the bowl away, breathing through his mouth like a man preventing his soul from escaping. That afternoon, Brother Gideon approached him with the painfully earnest seriousness of someone delivering a diagnosis. "You seem troubled," Gideon said. Aurelius forced stillness. "I am fine." Gideon nodded sympathetically. "Doubt is a demon, you know." Aurelius blinked. "I never said anything about doubt." "You didn't have to," Gideon answered, patting Aurelius's shoulder with the solemnity of a man comforting a dying horse. "Your aura is wilting, quite visibly." Aurelius considered screaming into a pillow. That evening, during meditation, Aurelius closed his eyes and tried with heroic determination, to silence his mind. But silence refused. Instead, he heard the faint, unmistakable sound of something tapping. He opened his eyes. Nothing there. He closed his eyes again. Tap. He opened them. Still nothing. He inhaled. Closed them again. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic sound of truth knocking. He snapped his eyes open, heart racing. Several monks turned to look at him, mildly alarmed by his repeated blinking at the wall, like someone attempting communication with an invisible entity. Aurelius excused himself. He went to his cot, sat down, buried his face in his hands, and whispered, "What is happening to me?" His heart thudded disobediently. His mind whirled like a novice assigned to his first theological debate. His faith hung at his side like a cloak he was no longer sure fit his shoulders. He looked at the 9th lantern hanging unlit near the refectory entrance. It seemed a little too still, a little too aware. He looked away quickly. By dusk, Aurelius felt the world folding, not collapsing, just folding, softly, quietly, like a disciplined monk folding laundry. But every crease was a new uncertainty. Night fell fully. The monastery darkened, candles flickered. Aurelius stood alone in the courtyard, breathing cold air that felt like a question asked by the universe. He wanted clarity. He wanted certainty. He wanted his old quiet faith back, the small, polite kind that didn't flicker lanterns or animate porridge. But crisis had already begun. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the unsteady rhythm beneath his ribs. Everything was trembling. Everything was listening. Everything was too close. He whispered to the night, "If this is a test, please send instructions." A single distant owl hooted. Unhelpfully, he closed his eyes. The darkness behind them felt heavier than usual. He opened them again. The stars stared back, cold, ancient, uninterested in his unraveling. And Aurelius, realizing with exquisite dread that he was no longer standing on the safe ground of innocent faith, felt himself sinking into the true beginning of his spiritual crisis. Not doubt, not fear, but awareness that something forgotten was calling him. Awareness that denial could no longer contain the pressure. Awareness that the truth, whatever it was, had begun its slow, inevitable arrival. The descent had begun, and Aurelius was not ready, but descent does not wait for readiness. It only waits for silence. And now the silence was broken. Every soul has a moment when the quiet unraveling becomes loud, when the whispers become shouts, when the universe, normally so subtle, so cryptically polite, drops its gentle hints and instead throws the entire celestial filing cabinet at your head. Aurelius, trembling somewhere between spiritual awakening and psychological collapse, reached that moment on a night so still it felt staged. The monastery had settled into its usual nocturnal hush. The long corridors slept. The candles burned their slow, contemplative burn. Even the wind behaved itself, drifting through ancient stone arches with the respectful restraint of a student entering a sacred library. Yet Aurelius could not sleep. He lay in his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling beams that had watched over generations of monks, some devout, some confused, most unwilling to admit which they were. The darkness above him swirled with questions he had tried, valiantly, foolishly, to ignore. What you fear to question is the teaching you most need. The phrase struck him again, sharp as a bell toll inside his skull. He rolled onto his side, then his back, then his other side. He rearranged his blanket exactly 13 times, a superstition he had invented that very moment in the desperate hope that ritual might coax clarity out of chaos. It didn't. Finally, he sat up, breath shallow, heart tapping an anxious rhythm against his ribs. He whispered into the dark, "I cannot keep pretending." And the dark whispered back, not in sound but in pressure, an invisible, palpable tightening of the air around him. A sensation like expectation, as though the night itself leaned closer. Aurelius stood. He lit a candle. The flame shivered theatrically, protesting the disturbance. He carried it through the corridor, passing closed doors, behind which his brothers slept peacefully, blissfully unaware that the monastery was chewing on Aurelius's sanity like an old philosophical bone. He turned toward the scriptorium. The silent room awaited him like a memory he did not wish to revisit. He shouldn't go in. He went in. Inside, the candlelight flickered across rows of scrolls, manuscripts, and heavy tomes whose pages held centuries of theological certainty, confusion, contradictions, and the occasional doodle left by bored scribes. Everything looked ordinary, eerily ordinary, as though the room knew he expected strangeness and was determined to disappoint him. Except for the blank book. It sat where he had left it, except it wasn't blank anymore. Aurelius froze in the doorway. The candle trembled in his hand. The book lay open, its pages filled, not entirely, but enough, with thin, sprawling handwriting that had not existed the last time he had seen it. Ink that shimmered faintly in the candle glow. letters that bent and curled like vines, reluctant to be read. "No," Aurelius whispered. "Absolutely not. This is a dream." He stepped closer. His heartbeat throbbed in his throat. He reached out, hesitated, and finally touched the page. The ink was dry. He swallowed. The words read, "When the lantern flickers, follow it. When the dust stirs, listen. When denial breaks, be still. For truth is patient, but patience is not truth." Aurelius stared. The candle flickered. His breath faltered. He tried to speak, but language had temporarily evacuated the premises. He closed the book gently, the way one closes the eyelids of something recently deceased. He backed away. His mind raced with explanations, none of them helpful. Sleepwalking scribes, ink demons, Cassian experimenting with new calligraphy techniques. God, not God. His own exhaustion. The universe having a mild psychotic episode. He steadied himself and whispered, "I am hallucinating." The scriptorium door swung shut on its own. Aurelius screamed internally, politely. He turned toward the door to leave. But then, before he could touch the handle, the 9th lantern flickered. Not down the hall, not faintly, not timidly, but fiercely. Light burst through the scriptorium window like a gasp made visible, illuminating the dust in the air, turning each particle into a floating speck of revelation. Shadows danced against the shelves like creatures too old to have names. Aurelius spun around, heart hammering, eyes wide. "What do you want from me?" he shouted at the universe, which, as usual, declined to answer in a way that would simplify anything. The lantern flickered again. A pulse, then another. The room brightened with each tremor of light. Aurelius fell to his knees, not in reverence, not in fear, but in sheer exhaustion, a cosmic defeat, a collapse of his entire attempt at composure. He pressed his forehead against the cold stone floor. His whisper cracked the silence. "Please, stop, I am not ready." The lantern responded with a brief blaze, the brightest yet. And then darkness. Not ordinary darkness, not peaceful darkness. A darkness that filled the scriptorium like a substance, heavy, living, expectant. His candle extinguished, his breath caught. He felt the air thicken around him, curling, folding, embracing him in a way that did not feel entirely metaphorical. Then something spoke. Not in sound, not in language, but in meaning. It seeped into him like ink drawn into parchment. You searched for clarity. You clung to certainty. You denied the question. And now you must hear it. Aurelius shook his head violently. "No, no, I did not search. I avoided. I resisted. I prayed. I refuse." The meaning replied, "Exactly." The irony hit him like a theological brick. He had done everything to avoid the truth and, in doing so, had followed the very path truth required. His heart thundered. His throat tightened. He felt a pressure building, not from outside him, but inside, as though a question buried long ago had begun clawing upward, demanding release. He tried to breathe, tried to center himself, failed spectacularly. The room spun. The darkness pressed tighter. In the distance, or perhaps only in his mind, he heard the faint crackling of parchment, the rustle of ancient pages, the sound of forgotten teachings stretching, yawning, preparing to speak after centuries of silence. He whimpered, "Please, don't." The meaning whispered, "Breaking is the beginning." And Aurelius broke, not with a shatter, but with a soft, aching exhale. His denial dissolved. His strength faltered. His certainty collapsed like an altar built on uneven foundations. He felt himself falling, not physically, but spiritually, mentally, existentially, falling into an abyss not of darkness, but of vast, terrifying awareness. a cavern of truth with no floor. Images flashed through his mind. The ninth lantern glowing, the blank book filled, the dust forming eyes, the stew rippling, the faces in the porridge, the whispered phrase, the dream, the signs, the questions. He saw himself reflected in all of them, small, trembling, unprepared, and yet called. The darkness swirled. The lantern pulsed faintly, once, like a tired heartbeat, and then everything stilled. Aurelius knelt alone in the silence, breath ragged, chest aching, mind trembling with the aftershocks of something he could neither understand nor ignore. He whispered, barely audible, "Why me?" The silence considered this, then responded with a single deeply unhelpful truth. "Why not?" Aurelius collapsed backward, staring at the ceiling through tears he refused to acknowledge. He felt hollowed out, unanchored, as though someone had gently removed his spiritual skeleton and replaced it with fog. He wanted clarity. He had received catastrophe. He wanted peace. He had received purpose, its terrifying twin. He wanted to go back. He had crossed a threshold that did not permit return. Everything was quiet now. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after an earthquake. The kind of quiet that precedes revelation. The kind of quiet that makes monks whisper prayers they do not fully believe. Aurelius lay on the stone floor for a long time, unmoving. The crisis had become a breaking, and the breaking had become a beginning. But beginnings, as always, looked suspiciously like endings from the inside. He rose slowly, trembling, and whispered, "What now?" The universe, exhausted from all its dramatic gestures, returned to its favorite strategy: silence. In the aftermath, the strangest thing was not the voice without words, nor the lantern that had dared to flicker, nor the book that wrote itself when nobody was looking. No, the strangest thing was what came next. Nothing. Utter, resounding, majestic. Nothing. As if the universe had delivered its cryptic blow, shattered his internal altar, then stepped back and said, "Well, that's enough drama for this decade," and went out for a cosmic walk. You would think that after such a breaking, after such an interior earthquake, the world would keep trembling, that candles would flare ominously when he entered a room, that stray pages would keep falling open to suspicious phrases, that the ninth lantern would continue pulsing like a holy migraine, that at the very least the porridge would spell out a follow-up message. But no. Silence. The next morning, Aurelius awoke with his cheek pressed to the cold stone floor of the scriptorium. Candle stub melted beside him like some loyal, exhausted accomplice. The book lay shut. The shelves sat still. The air smelled only of wax and dust and an aftertaste of last night's panic. Nothing glowed. Nothing whispered. Nothing moved except his own reluctant lungs. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined everything, if the entire event had been a very elaborate dream crafted by his overtired mind, which had finally decided to stage its own spiritual theater. It was a comforting possibility. Comforting and deeply insulting. Being spiritually deceived by a demon would at least be dramatic. Being duped by his own nervous system felt tacky. He pushed himself upright, slowly, joints aching, as if his bones had participated in some ritual he had not consented to. The room looked normal, offensively normal. Books, dust, a crooked stool, his own footprints from the night before, faintly smudged. He turned to the shelf where the blank book had sat. It was there, closed, its spine unremarkable, its presence somehow innocent. He reached for it, hesitant like someone touching a hot pan they're almost sure has cooled. He opened it, blank. First page blank. Second page blank. Third page blank. The sentence he had once read, "What you fear to question," was gone. The later message, "Follow the lantern," vanished. White space stared back at him with the serene audacity of someone who had absolutely not been the scene of a crisis last night. Aurelius laughed. A short, cracked sound. "Of course," he murmured. "Of course you're blank. Because why make anything simple?" He shut the book gently, as if afraid it might sue him for false accusations. The ninth lantern, visible through the narrow window, hung silent over the entrance hall. No glow, no pulse, no dramatic flare. Just an old metal lantern, perfectly at home among the spiders. It felt like waking up after a storm to find the sky bright and clean, and utterly uninterested in the fact that your house is now tilted. He rose, smoothed his robe, and walked back toward the dormitory. No one stopped him. No one asked. The other monks, already stirring, greeted him with the sleepy nod of men whose greatest concern was whether breakfast would be edible. No one looked at him and said, "You look like you've spoken with a wordless force that rearranged your soul," which, frankly, was rude. Morning prayers arrived like clockwork, as they always did. The bell rang its measured notes. The brothers filed into the chapel. Aurelius took his usual place. He knelt when he was supposed to kneel. He stood when he was supposed to stand. His voice joined theirs, reciting words he had known since childhood. Only now the words felt hollow. Not empty, no. Emptiness would have been too clear. They felt like shells, the outer form of meaning without the living creature inside. He spoke them anyway, partly from habit, partly from fear that, if he did not, the silence beneath them would drag him under. An odd calm settled over him. Not peaceful, not comforting, more like the numbness that follows a sudden injury, when the body decides to delay the pain until it can be more efficiently scheduled. His thoughts moved slowly, as if wading through ash. He looked at the abbot's face and wondered how many times that man had kneaded his own doubt into tidy sermons. He listened to the chants and thought, with a sort of weary irony, how many of us are still singing to avoid hearing something else? He did not glow. He did not radiate revelation. He did not suddenly understand all mysteries or see through time or perceive the secret architecture of God's hidden plan. He just felt tired, deeply, cosmically tired, as though he had spent the night arguing with infinity, and infinity had simply waited for him to exhaust himself. After prayers, he walked into the courtyard. The sky was an indifferent blue. The cold air settled on his skin like a quiet accusation. The herbs in the garden merely smelled like herbs. No halo, no omen, just time. Brother Cassian waved at him, holding up a carrot as if it were a mystical artifact. "Look, Aurelius. It grew in the shape of a cross." Aurelius regarded it. It did, in fact, vaguely resemble a cross. It also vaguely resembled a fork, a tree, and someone's strangely bent leg. "Profound," Aurelius murmured. "Perhaps the divine is trying to encourage your gardening." Cassian beamed, entirely satisfied. Aurelius walked on. Inside him, the storm had gone quiet. But the silence it left behind was not the gentle silence of a chapel at dusk. It was the raw, unsettling silence of a room where someone has just shouted and left. That echo that hums in the furniture, that sensation that the walls remember. He went to his chores. He swept. He scrubbed. He copied texts. He answered questions. He nodded at lectures. On the surface, he performed his role exactly as before. A monk whose faith appeared well maintained, if perhaps slightly haunted around the edges. Only he knew that something essential had shifted, that he was no longer standing in his faith, but slightly beside it, watching it with cautious curiosity, as if inspecting an old garment to see where it had thinned. The signs stopped. That was the cruelest part. No more faces in porridge. No more dust patterns with eyes. No more stew that breathed or sparrows pecking at incriminating phrases. The universe, having thrown everything at him, now sat back in impeccable silence, like a teacher who has assigned the final exam and folded their hands. He waited for another flicker of the 9th lantern. Days passed. Nothing. He waited for the blank book to come alive again. It remained a profoundly unhelpful compilation of empty pages. He listened at night for that wordless voice that had invaded him. It did not return. Instead, there was just space. Space in his thoughts. Space in his prayers. Space between his chest and his faith, like distance between two people who once stood very close, but now pretend to admire the same landscape from opposite sides of the room. He began to notice sounds he had never paid attention to before. The small scrape of sandals on stone. The soft, defeated breath of an old monk sitting down. The faint wheeze of the bell rope as a novice pulled it. The crackle of the fire in the hearth, devouring wood with the same calm hunger every night. The world felt thinner, more exposed, as if someone had turned down the background music. He found himself lingering in the chapel after everyone had left, not out of devotion, but out of an odd, reluctant hope that something might happen again, that the silence might break, that the lantern might tremble, that God, or whatever had spoken through that darkness, might finish the sentence. Nothing. He stayed so long one evening that Brother Gideon returned, concerned. "You are here late, Aurelius. Are you seeking deeper communion?" Aurelius considered telling the truth. "No, I am loitering in case the universe decides to assault me again." Instead, he smiled mildly and said, "Just lingering." Gideon nodded with solemn approval. "Ah, the holiest moments are in the lingering." Aurelius almost laughed. The holiest moments, he thought, were the ones that wrecked you and then refused to clean up after themselves. He woke in the middle of the night sometimes, heart racing, expecting the darkness to thicken again, the floor to swell under layers of meaning. But it was just night. Quiet, uneventful night. The beams above him creaked like old bones. Another brother snored softly 2 cots away. A distant owl called. No cryptic messages, no metaphysical drama, just life continuing its disinterested rhythm. And so, in this strange, unsettled calm, Aurelius began to think, not the way he had thought before, with his familiar comfortable loops of speculation about divine order and minor doctrinal disputes. Now his thinking sank inwards, into the hollow space the breaking had left. He sat one afternoon alone in the cloister, watching the dust in the sunlight. Dust, ash, particles of things that used to be solid. Tiny funerals drifting lazily through the air. He realized, with a bitter little smile, that his faith felt a bit like that, now, powdered, dispersed, still present, but no longer structured. He asked himself, for the first time without excuses, what if everything I believed was just a story? Not a false story, necessarily, just a story. A human attempt to wrap words around something that didn't want to be wrapped. A system of metaphors dressed up as certainty. He didn't like the question. He didn't like the part of himself that had dared to ask it. He remembered the phrase, "What you fear to question is the teaching you most need." "What if," he whispered to the sunlit dust, "the teaching isn't a new doctrine, but the courage to let the old ones fall apart. The dust swirled lazily, uninterested in being turned into a metaphor. He thought of the 9th lantern, hanging in patient darkness. How long had it been waiting? For centuries, all their prayers, all their rituals, all their attempts to decode its prophecy had led nowhere. And then, in the smallest, most private, least documented moment of his life, it flickered. Not for the community, not for the chronicles, for him, for his crisis, for his collapse. It was almost offensive. Miracles, he thought dryly, ought to be better scheduled. He wondered if anyone would believe him if he told them. The 9th lantern glowed for me. The book wrote itself. The darkness spoke. I shattered. Now here I am, sweeping the corridor as if the floor cares nothing about my existential crisis. He imagined the abbot blinking slowly and saying, perhaps you need more rest. He imagined Gideon triumphantly diagnosing him with insufficient doctrinal reading. He imagined Cassian insisting it must be a sign that the carrots were about to become more spiritually significant. He did not tell anyone. The silence grew deeper. There is a kind of sarcastic tenderness in the way the universe abandons you after giving you a glimpse of something more. Here, it says, have a revelation. Now, kindly, go back to your chores. And no, there will be no follow-up explanation. Aurelius found himself drifting at the edge of his routines, present in body, absent in essence. He watched himself praying and thought, almost clinically, look at that. My mouth still knows the words. He watched himself copying scriptures and observed, my hands remember how to draw the letters for mercy, even when I don't know what it means. He began to notice how many of the brothers were also moving like that. Faithful, disciplined, slightly hollow. He wondered how many of them had had their own storms, their own lanterns, their own unreadable books, and then quietly buried the experience under more layers of ritual. He wondered how many teachings had been forgotten, not because they were dangerous, but because they were exhausting. The calm continued. Days passed. The discomfort of his crisis dulled into a low, constant ache, like a bruise you forget about until you bump it again. Sometimes he felt almost normal. He laughed, politely, at Cassian's garden-related revelations. He traded minor, sarcastic comments with the cook about the stew's ongoing war with human digestion. He listened to Gideon's lectures and resisted the urge to draw halos on his own doubts. And sometimes, without warning, the memory of that wordless presence would rush back, a black tide flooding his chest, reminding him that whatever had touched him had not been imagination. That forgetting was not an option, even if nothing ever happened again. There was one evening, quiet, smoky, the sky the color of cooled ashes, when he sat alone by the small fire in the refectory after everyone else had gone. The embers pulsed. Logs fell in upon themselves with soft sighs, collapsing into glowing dust. He stared at them for a long time, and finally spoke aloud, just once. If that was you, you could at least have the courtesy to continue. The embers popped, sending up a small spray of sparks. One of them landed near his hand. He brushed it away. The fire crackled, indifferent, busy with its own slow dying. In that moment, Aurelius discovered a new kind of prayer, a prayer that did not ask for anything, did not praise, did not confess, did not bargain, a prayer that was simply presence, him and a silence that refused to fill itself, him and a God who might be there, might not, might be something stranger entirely, something that had more to do with questions than answers. It was not comforting, but it was honest. And in that unsettling calm, in that ash-filled quiet, he began to suspect that the forgetting of teachings was not an accident, that some truths were too disruptive to keep in the open, too sharp to handle without gloves of ritual and distraction. He suspected, with a weary smile, that he was now walking in the ruins of those truths, not understanding them, not possessing them, just living in their aftermath. Perhaps that was all revelation ever did. Leave ruins where certainty used to stand, then wait to see what you do with the rubble. The days blurred, calm on the surface, chaos within. Aurelius moved through them with the slowness of someone who has lost a war no one else knew was happening. He did not know it yet, but this silence, the ashes, the dust, the strange wide emptiness, was not the end of his story. It was simply the space being cleared. For what? He did not know, not yet. But the question had begun walking beside him, and questions, once awakened, rarely go back to sleep. There is a silence that follows catastrophe, a silence so unnervingly calm that it feels like an insult. A silence that behaves as if nothing happened, as if the world did not open its ribs to reveal something ancient and uninvited, as if your soul did not get rearranged like a poorly organized bookshelf. Aurelius awoke into that silence each day now, as if slipping into cold water. He no longer had the energy to fear. This was not the silence of peace. Peace has texture, soft, warm, like a woolen blanket draped over the shoulders. This silence was dry, brittle, dust swirling lazily in beams of indifferent sunlight. The air felt emptier. The monastery stones felt older. Everything seemed to have stepped 1 inch further away from him, without explanation or apology. It was as though reality had briefly opened its mouth to speak, and then remembered it had errands to run. Aurelius rose every morning feeling slightly misplaced. He would sit up in his cot, staring into the dimness, waiting for the panic of the previous nights to return. But it didn't. Not exactly. Instead, something heavier lingered, like the memory of a blow rather than the blow itself. His heart felt bruised. His beliefs felt like broken pottery wrapped in cloth, stored on a shelf he avoided looking at. He missed the certainty he once had. Small, humble, imperfect, but reliable. He missed believing that he knew the shape of his faith, the edges of his world, the rules of divine order. Now everything felt open-ended, like a sentence that refused to finish itself. He stepped out into the corridor. The stones whispered under his feet, not literally, but in that figurative way stones sometimes communicate, quietly reminding you they've survived longer than your doubts and will still be cold when your revelations become old news. Morning prayers unfolded as usual. Chants echoed under arches that had heard the doubts of centuries and kept every one of them as dust in their corners. Aurelius sang the words mechanically, his voice steady but hollow, the echoes returning to him with the politeness of someone who doesn't want to bring up an uncomfortable topic. The others did not notice the shift within him. Why would they? People rarely notice the inner fractures of someone who performs their outer structure flawlessly. Aurelius knelt when he was supposed to kneel, bowed when he was supposed to bow, recited when he was supposed to recite. If anything, he appeared calmer than before, because collapse often mimics serenity. Brother Gideon actually congratulated him one morning. "Your devotion has deepened," he said, nodding approvingly. "There's a profound stillness around you." Aurelius nearly laughed. "Yes," he said, "very profound. Stillness indeed. Like the stillness of a lake after a stone has sunk to the bottom, leaving only quiet rings to fade slowly on the surface. He walked through the monastery with eyes that saw everything differently. The cloister garden looked the same. The rosemary, the thyme, the crooked arch, casting gentle shadows on the path. But to Aurelius it felt drained, like someone had taken the color from it, leaving only the shape. The sparrows hopped along the stones, chirping in their cheerful, oblivious way. Aurelius envied them. Birds never seemed to struggle with metaphysical crises. If a sparrow encountered a forgotten teaching, it would simply sit on it and maybe build a nest out of the footnotes. He sat on the wooden bench beneath the fig tree and closed his eyes. For years, he'd come to this garden seeking quiet, comfort, small moments of presence. Now, quiet was all he had, but none of the comfort remained. It was strange. He had survived the breaking, but the rebuilding had not begun. He whispered into the stillness, "Are you waiting for something?" The wind did not answer, though it shifted slightly, as if reconsidering whether it wanted to participate. He got up and went to his chores. Sweeping the eastern corridor used to bring him a mild sense of order. Now, the broom scraped across stone with a hollow sound that made him feel detached, as though he were sweeping the floor of someone else's life. The dust rose in lazy clouds, drifting through the air like ghosts. He watched it, entranced. Dust is simply memory without a narrative, tiny remnants of what once had structure. He felt a kinship with it now. He swept slower. He paused. He touched a patch of dust with his fingers. Nothing moved. Nothing formed shapes. Nothing stared back. He almost missed the absurdity of earlier signs. A porridge face, stew that breathed, dust that winked. Ridiculous, yes, but at least they were something. Now the universe had gone back to its preferred mode. Enigmatic silence flavored with mild disdain. He finished sweeping the corridor and moved to the scriptorium. The blank book remained exactly where he had left it, closed, harmless, as if the events of nights past had been a mutual hallucination shared between him and fate. He opened it again. Blank pages, blank, blank, blank. He stared at the emptiness and felt an unexpected anger bloom in his chest. "You spoke," he whispered to the book, as though addressing an old friend who had stopped returning letters. "You said something. You started something. And now, this?" The blank page remained blank with impeccable confidence. Cowardly, he thought. Or perhaps the universe was practicing that ancient spiritual strategy. Deliver half of a revelation, then vanish before anyone asks follow-up questions. He placed the book back on the shelf more firmly than necessary. The day passed in that numb, ash-filled way. The sky hung low with winter clouds that looked weary. The bells rang for meals. The monks ate in silence. Aurelius tasted nothing. He moved through everything as though underwater, the world distorted, slower, muffled. Gideon lectured about resilience of faith. Cassian rhapsodized about herb growth. The abbot murmured about duty. Aurelius heard none of it. Not truly. He wanted something. Not answers, necessarily. Not certainty. Not signs or voices or lanterns that behaved as though enrolled in drama school. He wanted acknowledgement. Recognition that something had shifted in him, that something had happened, that the silence he was drowning in was not just absence, it was aftermath. But the world offered no such tenderness. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the sky, darkened like ink poured into water, Aurelius stood in the courtyard, staring at the 9th lantern. It hung motionless. He approached slowly. Dust clung to its base, cool, ancient, undisturbed dust. He touched it lightly. Nothing. He closed his eyes. Still nothing. He leaned his forehead against the stone wall, exhaustion pouring through him. "What am I supposed to do now?" he whispered, not expecting a reply. The world obliged by giving him none. He pulled away and looked upward. The stars were beginning to appear, shyly at first, then with growing confidence. They blinked with their usual ancient indifference, glorious, beautiful, and spectacularly unhelpful. "You knew this would happen," he told them softly. "You watched. You always watch. And you say nothing." A breeze drifted past him, carrying the smell of cold stone and distant pine. It brushed against his robe like a dismissive shrug. He sat on the ground, knees drawn up, staring at nothing. And in that nothing, he began to feel something stirring, not revelation, not insight, not a dramatic cosmic continuation, but loss. A grief so quiet he almost didn't recognize it. He was grieving the faith he used to have, the small, simple, dependable faith that had not known the weight of unanswered questions or the cruelty of half-revealed truths, the faith that had sheltered him like a modest home, only to collapse after a single tremor. He grieved the innocence that had made belief easy. He grieved the certainty that had once steadied his prayers. He grieved himself, who he had been before all this. He whispered into the dark, "Why show me something I cannot understand?" The silence shifted slightly, like a sleeping creature adjusting its position. Aurelius bowed his head. The dust around him stirred, not into shapes, not into messages, simply lifted by the breeze, swirling briefly before settling again in a new pattern. The silence felt deeper now, layered upon itself, an emptiness that held a strange presence, like a pause before speech. The storm had broken him. The silence was remaking him, not into what he had been, not into what he wanted, but into someone who could no longer accept the world as a closed box. He inhaled slowly, exhaled. His breath formed a faint cloud in the cold air. For the first time, he did not ask for a sign. He did not demand answers. He did not beg for clarity. He simply sat in the dust, in the stillness, in the quiet that pressed against his ribs like an unwelcome companion, and he allowed himself to feel it, not solve it, not escape it, just feel it. And in that fragile moment something inside him settled, not peacefully, but honestly. The silence was not the absence of guidance. It was an invitation. He did not yet understand to what. But for the first time since the breaking, he felt the faintest, most delicate shift in himself, as if the dust on his heart had begun to rearrange into a new pattern. Not revelation, not comfort, but possibility. And possibility, unlike signs or miracles, does not announce itself. It waits, it breathes, it lingers, it humbles. Aurelius remained there long after the stars had claimed the sky, until his knees ached, until the cold crept into his bones, until the silence around him no longer felt empty, but expectant. He stood finally, slowly, and whispered to the night, "I am listening." The night did not reply, but it also did not turn away. Revelation is a generous word, too generous, really. It implies clarity, beams of holy light, divine articulation, something with the decency to include a thesis statement. But what came to Aurelius next was not a revelation in the tidy, sermon-ready sense. It was something looser, stranger, slipperier, something that behaved like a revelation only long enough to make him doubt whether it had happened at all. Ambiguity, it turns out, is the universe's preferred teaching method. It began on a night that should have been forgettable. No storm, no mysterious wind, no abnormal flickering of flame, just a gray dusk slipping into a darker gray night. the kind monks rarely remember because the sky, much like doctrine, repeated itself too faithfully. Aurelius lay in bed, eyes open, mind circling itself like a tired pilgrim unsure of the correct shrine. Sleep refused him, as it often did now. Silence coiled around him, not threatening anymore, but oddly familiar, like a stray dog that had followed him home and claimed him without his consent. He gave up on rest, sat up slowly, and let his feet touch the cold stone floor. He felt pulled, not by a voice, not by a calling, not by anything he could name. More like gravity had shifted its loyalties. He stood, wrapped his thin robe around him, and stepped into the corridor. No one else stirred. The monastery slept with the peacefulness of men convinced they understood the shape of God. Aurelius moved through the hall with the quiet of someone visiting a memory rather than a place. The lanterns along the walls burned steadily, their light too calm, too steady, as if mocking him for his instability. He turned toward the cloister garden, where night always felt a little deeper. The moon barely illuminated the courtyard. Shapes blurred into shadow. The garden's herbs, rosemary, sage, thyme, spread their scents faintly through the cold air like old prayers escaping the soil. Aurelius stepped into the center of the courtyard. He closed his eyes. He inhaled. He waited. Nothing. So he sat down, cross-legged, not in a meditative posture he'd learned, but in the way a tired man sits without planning to rise soon. His breath slowed. His thoughts softened their grip. The world became a wide, dark bowl around him. And that was when he heard it. A sound, not external, not internal, something in between. A soft humming. No melody, no rhythm, yet undeniably intentional. The sound seemed to come from the stones, from the air, from the space between his breaths. He opened his eyes quickly. Nothing, but the humming continued, not with the confidence of revelation, but with the awkwardness of a message unsure whether it had misdialed the recipient. Aurelius stood, heart trembling but not panicking. He was far past panic now. Panic belonged to earlier chapters. He whispered, "Are you?" But the humming changed before he could finish. It shifted tone, deepened, flattened, then dissolved into a faint, crackling vibration. He froze. The ninth lantern glowed, not fully, not dramatically, not even confidently. It glowed the way a timid firefly glows for the first time, briefly, shyly, as if asking permission. Aurelius stared, breath caught in his chest. The glow strengthened, not into a flame, but into a suggestion of illumination, a possibility of light. His heart hammered. Something inside him leaned forward. Something else leaned back. The lantern brightened one slow pulse. Then another, then another. 3 pulses, then darkness. Aurelius whispered, "Why?" The lantern did not reply, but the air thickened around him, as if the question itself had weight. He felt something brush against his awareness, barely there, a sensation softer than memory. He reached for it without meaning to, his mind stretching like fingertips toward something unseen, and then he felt it. A presence, but not a presence. A thought, but not a thought. A nearness that wasn't near. It folded around him like a cloak woven from uncertainty. It said nothing. It meant everything. Aurelius gasped, What are you?" The presence trembled, not in fear, not in anger, but in confusion, as if it were asking the same question. He steadied himself and tried again. "Are you a sign?" A warmth drifted through him, not warmth as in temperature, but warmth as in recognition. "Are you a teaching?" A shiver, not cold, not warning, passed through his bones. His heart softened, his mind widened. His fear thinned. "Are you God?" A pause. A longer pause. A pause so long it became a message. Not yes, not no, something far more unsettling, irrelevant. Aurelius exhaled shakily, his breath fogging in the cold air. The presence pulsed faintly around him, 3 soft pulses echoing the lantern's glow. He whispered, "What do you want from me?" The presence felt suddenly heavier, denser, as if leaning closer. Then, a single impression entered his mind. Not words, not images, something older. Not a command, an invitation. He felt in his skull and in his bones a message shaped like, "Look." Aurelius turned slowly. But the garden looked the same. The walls, the arches, the herbs, the fountain. He frowned. Look at what? The presence dimmed slightly, as if exasperated. He tried again, softening his breath, softening his gaze, and that was when he noticed it. The stones beneath his feet, their pattern, their alignment, the way the cracks formed lines, the way the moss grew in shapes. Not random, not at all. It formed almost a symbol, half complete, barely noticeable, but unmistakably deliberate. Aurelius stared, breath trembling. The presence pressed gently against his mind. Look deeper. He knelt, tracing the pattern lightly with his fingers. The symbol felt ancient, older than the monastery, older than the 9th lantern, older than the teachings. But before he could decipher it, a drop of water fell from the sky. Then another, then a dozen. Then rain poured down with the sudden conviction of a revelation interrupted. The presence vanished. The humming stopped. The lantern remained dark. Aurelius blinked upward, drenched in a heartbeat. The stones under him darkened with rain, the symbol dissolving instantly, as though it had never existed. He reached for it desperately. Gone. He looked toward the lantern. Still. Silent. Ordinary. He felt the presence withdrawing, not angrily, not abruptly. Just fading, like a dream slipping through fingers unwilling to wake. He whispered into the storm, "Come back." But the rain answered instead. Water streamed down his face, the cold air stung his cheeks, the wind pushed at him like a gentle scold. He stood slowly. The symbol was gone. The presence was gone. The glow was gone. Everything was exactly as it had been before. Except Aurelius. He walked back to his room in a daze, soaked, shivering, mind burning with the after-image of something that refused to define itself. He lay in his cot, staring upward, rain dripping softly from his robe. What was that? He whispered to the dark. The dark remained silent. He whispered again. What am I supposed to do? Nothing answered. Yet something in him, his breath, his bones, his trembling heart knew. Something had changed. But not clearly, not completely, not helpfully. It was revelation in its least satisfying form. Suggestive, inconclusive, unsolvable. And worst of all, it demanded more questions than answers. He closed his eyes, and the last thought before sleep claimed him was not despair. It was curiosity, exhausted, trembling curiosity. Look deeper. By the time the rain dried from the stones and the memory of the symbol had fully dissolved into the earth, Aurelius found himself living in a strange new middle. Not the certainty of before, not the crisis of during, not the revelation that never finished happening. Something else. A state of suspension, of becoming, of standing in the doorway between two worlds without committing to either. If faith had once been a lantern he carried, now it was an open window. Wind came and went. Shadows lengthened and shrank. The world moved through him, and he no longer knew where he ended, and the questions began. He walked through the monastery like a guest at his own life. The familiar gestures remained. sweeping corridors, chanting prayers, copying texts in careful lines. But everything felt subtly displaced, as if someone had nudged the entire building 1 inch to the left. Days passed in that soft disorientation. The 9th lantern, damn it, did not flicker, not once. It hung cold and indifferent, an object whose glow, real or imagined, belonged to a night that now felt like myth. Aurelius stared at it often, hoping to catch it embarrassed, hoping its metal would twitch or sigh, or at least acknowledge that something had occurred. Nothing. Candles burned. Dust drifted. His brothers lived their quiet cycles of devotion without noticing that one among them now walked with a shadow that was not darkness, but unfinished truth. And silence followed him. Not the heavy silence of fear, not the brittle silence of broken faith. What followed him now was a listening silence. A silence that wanted him to speak first. He did not know what to say. One afternoon, he sat beneath the fig tree in the cloister garden, legs stretched out, eyes half closed. The sun warmed his skin. Birds murmured in the ivy, leaves whispered in small, curious voices. Everything was ordinary, and yet everything felt slightly charged, as if the world were holding its breath around him. Cassian approached, holding a basket of herbs. "Aurelius," he said softly, "you haven't been yourself." Aurelius considered that, then answered with uncharacteristic honesty, "Perhaps I am becoming myself." Cassian blinked. A philosophical statement was the last thing he had prepared for. "Is that good?" Aurelius smiled, tired but genuine. "It is uncomfortable." Cassian nodded with deep sympathy. "Like sandals that don't fit." Aurelius chuckled. "Yes, very much like that." Cassian, reassured, wandered away, humming a tune that had no business existing. Aurelius leaned back, watching sunlight filter between leaves. Everything looked sharper, more textured. Even the shadows seemed more intentional. It made him uneasy. The world was not supposed to participate in his interior life. He spent nights thinking about the symbol he saw in the stones, half-formed, gone too quickly, but unmistakably real. He wondered whether he had found it or imagined it, or both. He wondered whether the presence that touched him was divine, or internal, or ancient, or hungry, or simply curious. He wondered who he was now that certainty no longer cushioned his thoughts. And every night he returned to the courtyard, not expecting anything, just listening. Sometimes he whispered, "Are you still there?" Sometimes, "Should I continue?" Sometimes, "What was the teaching?" But the silence never broke. It shifted, yes. It watched. It waited. But it never answered. Until one evening. It was late, later than most novices were allowed awake. The sky was slipping from deep blue to black. The lanterns along the walls flickered in a nervous, tired rhythm. Aurelius stood alone in the courtyard again, hands tucked in his sleeves, breath visible in the cooling air. He gazed at the stones where the symbol had once appeared. Nothing remained. He whispered, barely audible, "I am trying to understand." Silence. But this time it felt warmer, as if the world had stepped a fraction closer. He swallowed. Was the symbol real? A faint breeze stirred. A leaf fell. No answer. He tried again. Was the presence real? Another breeze. A soft rustle in the fig tree. Still nothing. Finally, he closed his eyes and asked the question that had lived inside him since the breaking. What am I supposed to do now? This time, the silence thickened. Not dark, not cold, not empty, a fullness, a density. Like stepping into a room where something had just been spoken, though no ears had heard it. Aurelius opened his eyes and saw, not a lantern flicker, not a vision, not a miracle, but a shadow, his own shadow, cast long across the stones, except it wasn't cast by the lanterns. There was no light behind him. He turned. No one. Nothing. He looked down again. The shadow was still there, and within it, faintly, barely, almost invisibly, lines formed. Curves, angles, shapes, the suggestion of a symbol. His breath caught. He blinked. The lines shifted, faded, returned, not stable, not fully present, like a memory trying to become real. He knelt, placed his hand over the shadow. He whispered, "What does it mean?" The lines pulsed faintly, then dissolved completely, leaving his shadow ordinary once more. He remained kneeling. He felt no fear, just recognition. Something was unfolding, but not quickly, not clearly, not for him alone. He sat back on his heels, feeling the night wrap around him like a cloak. "Do you want me to follow you?" he whispered. The silence answered with a long, slow breath of wind, brushing his cheek like a reluctant blessing. Aurelius stood. He looked at the 9th lantern, still dark, still unhelpful, still patient. He spoke to it softly. "You could at least pretend to participate." No response. He almost smiled. There was comfort in the universe's stubbornness. He walked back toward the dormitory but stopped at the entrance. He felt something behind him, not presence, not revelation, just continuity. The sense that the story hadn't ended and would not end, not today, not tomorrow. He turned once more toward the courtyard. The shadows stretched long. The lanterns glowed dim. The stars blinked like tired archivists filing away memories of human confusion. Aurelius whispered, "Is this the beginning or the end?" The night did not answer. It didn't need to. He realized, with a slow, dawning ache, that he was now living in a chapter with no conclusion. A chapter meant to remain open. A path whose next steps he could not see. He stepped inside the hall, paused, and murmured a final, weary joke. Maybe God was busy tonight, or avoiding messages, like every Monday. He shut the door gently behind him. The silence waited outside, listening. Not ending, never ending, just turning the page. Long after the monastery had surrendered itself to sleep, long after the lanterns had burned themselves down to quiet stubs of amber light, Aurelius sat alone in the scriptorium, surrounded by the faint glow of a single candle. It was one of those rare, trembling flames that behaved as though it carried secrets, leaning, listening, bending as if trying to whisper with its own tiny tongue of fire. The blank book sat before him, still blank, still ordinary, still infuriating. His fingers hovered above the open page, not to write, but to feel the delicate air above it, the thin space between paper and revelation, between silence and the possibility of meaning. That space felt different now, not filled, not awakened, but aware, as if the book were watching him back, timing its next move with exquisite cosmic patience. He exhaled slowly. The candle flickered in reply. For the first time since his breaking, he felt neither fear nor confusion, nor desperation. Instead, he felt a strange companionship. He was no longer alone with his doubt. It had transformed, softened, learned manners. It walked beside him now like a quiet, one-eyed dog someone had left on his doorstep. Occasionally inconvenient, occasionally wise, occasionally prone to biting, but undeniably his. He touched the edge of the page, tracing the grain of the parchment. "You," he whispered to the book, "are the worst communicator I have ever encountered." The book, maintaining its long tradition of ignoring him entirely, remained blank. Aurelius leaned back in his chair, gazing at the dancing candle shadows on the walls. They wavered like stories waiting for their narrator to gain enough courage or foolishness to speak them aloud. The monastery around him breathed its ancient breath, slow, heavy, content, as if nothing unusual had happened within its walls, as if one of its monks had not been unwound and re-stitched by an invisible thread of forgotten teaching, as if truth had not wandered the corridors recently, leaving footprints made of silence. He wondered, not for the first time, how many monks before him had reached this place, this strange borderland between knowing and unknowing. How many had seen the ninth lantern pulse, or felt the presence whisper from within the dark? How many had discovered half-formed symbols under their feet? How many had questioned, and then shut the door quietly behind them, returning to the safety of habit? How many truths had been forgotten, not because they were dangerous, but because no one wanted to deal with the paperwork? The candle sputtered slightly, then steadied. He closed the book with gentle care and stood, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. His robe rustled softly. His feet brushed against old stones that had collected more forgotten teachings than any library ever could. He walked to the window. Outside, the courtyard glowed faintly in the moonlight. Dust drifted lazily through silver beams, each particle suspended like a tiny fragment of lost scripture. The ninth lantern hung in its eternal stillness, quiet, heavy, unlit, yet somehow filled with an energy Aurelius could now feel in the back of his mind. A hum without sound, a pulse without movement. He touched the cold glass. "You don't have to glow tonight," he whispered to it. "I understand now." And strangely, he did. The lantern had flickered not to reveal answers, but to unmask questions. Questions he had been trained to ignore. Questions he had feared to ask. Questions that had always lived deep beneath his certainty. It had awakened him to the sacred truth that nothing, absolutely nothing, was as clear as it pretended to be. Faith is not a straight line. Revelation is not a clean event. Meaning is not a finished manuscript. All of it, every whispered prayer, every dusty scroll, every trembling doubt, is a draft. Aurelius turned away from the window and extinguished the candle with 2 fingers. Darkness bloomed around him, not frightening, not heavy, but soft, like the folds of a robe wrapped around him by someone unseen, someone patient, someone who did not require him to understand, only to continue. He walked back to his cot, but instead of lying down immediately, he sat on its edge, letting the silence pool around him like ink. He breathed it in. He let it settle. He welcomed it. There was a teaching in the silence, not clear, not complete, not ready for doctrine, but a teaching nonetheless. It whispered, "Keep going." He lay back slowly, folding his hands over his chest in the manner of monks who dream of restless truths. The darkness around him thickened, softened, curled like a cat at his feet. He closed his eyes. He did not pray, not in the old way. He simply opened himself, gently, cautiously, with the vulnerability of someone learning to trust the shape of uncertainty. And for the first time, uncertainty did not frighten him. It steadied him. Because in the hollow space left behind by broken certainty, something new had begun to take root. Not clarity, not answers, but a rhythm, a direction, a calling without words, not a call to understand, a call to seek. The forgotten teachings, they existed, not as scrolls hidden in dusty corners, not as prophecies waiting to be decoded, not as relics waiting for the right monk to sneeze near them. They existed in the wound, in the silence after the storm, in the fragile, trembling courage to ask the unaskable. He understood that now. Aurelius drifted toward sleep, the heavy comfort of darkness folding around him. Just before consciousness dissolved, he whispered, not to God, not to the lantern, not to the presence, not to himself, but to the story. I'm still listening. And the darkness, vast and ancient, answered him silently with its own patient breath. In the hallway outside, the ninth lantern swayed almost imperceptibly, stirred by a breeze that should not have been there. It did not glow, it did not flicker. It simply moved, just enough to let him know the silence was not empty. It was waiting, and somewhere in that quiet waiting, in the dust, in the breath, in the pages still unwritten, the forgotten teachings exhaled softly, as if stretching their limbs for the next night. Aurelius slept, and the story kept watching. If this story kept you awake a little longer tonight, subscribe to Religious Night Stories, where faith never sleeps, even if you do.